Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
Going to be compulsory if you want to do certain things. So it's unlikely, for instance, that you will be able to do air travel if you are not vaccinated. So the idea that we will have massive resistance to vaccination and that there won't be enough people vaccinated to generate general immunity seems to me a bit far-fetched. I think we're going to get people will sign on to vaccination actually very quickly once they understand that they can get on with normal life if they're vaccinated, and they can't if they're not. So my own view is that we are likely to have a situation where we should actually just sit that side. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the light in a reasonable manner while we're in the office. So welcome to our boardroom. The next issue after the vaccine is then to say, I do believe that one of the big things that you will hear a lot about in the next 5
Okay, Lee, are you there? We just wanted to switch to the office's Wi-Fi.
No problem. I can hear you, Master.
Okay, so we should have very few disturbances from here. So the idea is that I think that what we're going to see is a big drive from the World Health Organization and from governments worldwide to see whether we can't get to a situation where we eradicate COVID, so that 5 years from now there will be very little COVID left in the world, and we will revert to a COVID-free world in 5 years' time. So basically, it will take us all of the 5 years to get back to full normality from a health perspective. That is assuming that no new health issues arise. But given that this thing only happens once in 100 years, we can probably fairly confidently say that it's unlikely that another new virus will hit us in the next 5 years. So that, as far as the COVID is concerned, what that means then is we actually have to go through a couple of months of a quite intense COVID occurrence in the Northern Hemisphere, but that by the time we get to winter in South Africa, we should have significant vaccination, and therefore we can hope to avoid another very serious COVID incidence in South Africa. Not 100% sure yet, but we would hope to avoid it. So from there on in, the next question then is what happens to the economy? And what does happen to the economy is we are seeing a significant slowdown in the world economy at the moment, just because of all the lockdowns that are needed to keep COVID under control during the northern winter and before they get vaccinated. But we are very likely to see a fairly rapidly return to some forms of normality during roughly March to June next year, because as people get vaccinated in developed countries, we'll get back to some semblance of normality. Now, there are some things that don't return to normal. And the two things that we've identified is, number one, it's interesting that office work seemed to have changed forever. So what you're seeing at the moment is in the US, we're only seeing roughly 20% of office workers going back to the office at this stage. Now, obviously, it's because COVID is still around, etc., but it's also because it turns out that most office work, given current technology, can be done remotely. So therefore, offices are far less essential than they used to be. And a lot more people are now enabled and willing to work remotely, and there are far more things that are acceptable remotely. Therefore, we think that offices will be far less popular. So we think office rents are going to come down significantly, because as people reach the end of their office leases, they will want to have a serious renegotiation. And I just take our own business as an example. We certainly will not take up the same amount of office space that we used to occupy once our current lease expires in about 18 months' time. So the whole idea of offices and office space will be very different. So offices don't go back to normal. What that unfortunately also means is that a lot of businesses dependent on people going back to offices also don't come back to normal. So if you were running a coffee shop in the middle of Manhattan, where there's a huge number of office workers normally, your coffee shop is likely to not be nearly as popular. So a major restructuring of what it means to be in the office and how offices work. The corollary to that is it also restructures the way that people think about where they live and how they live. Meaning, if you were living in a small flat close to the middle of town, but it's close to your office and you only use it for sleeping, if you've been locked down in that dingy little flat for the last 9 months, then you are ready to move to the suburbs. So it seems like homes will also look very different. So you will actually design homes to have some kind of office space. So people will want more space at home because they will want some space to work from. The interesting question becomes, of course, do employers pay people to provide their own office space, or do employers take a pay cut in order to have the convenience of being able to work from home? In fact, the second one is where we find ourselves in most cases at this point. So companies are using the leverage they have to say to people, we'll allow you to work from home, but you'll actually take a bit of a pay cut for that convenience. But eventually it becomes the other way around. Companies won't have the cost of providing the same amount of office space, and they are likely to provide at least very good connectivity to their workers in order to enable them to work from home. So that obviously has a massive impact on the whole real estate business, meaning the ownership of offices, the banks that lend to the owners of offices, etc., a whole adjustment. And to some extent, the same goes for retail. So a lot of retail space is going to come free. I see yesterday it was announced that Debenhams in the UK will go into liquidation. Now that means 200 prime retail spots becoming available in the UK. So that will also place significant downward pressure on the people who own that. So the owners of commercial property are likely to keep taking some significant strain in the aftermath of of the situation. The other thing that will change permanently, more than likely, is travel. So the current estimate is that at least 30% of business travel that happened before will not happen anymore, meaning people will not travel around the world in order to meet with each other. They will just meet up on Teams.
Wikus,
Yes.
sorry, you went
Yes.
off for seconds there.
Sorry, guys, we should have very good reception at this point. My apologies. So just coming back to it, travel is the other industry that will probably be permanently damaged and not get back to normal, in the sense that roughly 30% of all business travel is likely to stop happening and be replaced by remote contact. So a Teams meeting will be good enough. You won't fly to New York or London. In our case, we would normally fly to places like Durban and Cape Town on a very, very regular basis. And we're still likely to do that fairly regularly, but still half the time that we would have before. So it seems to me that the 30% is probably about right. So 70% of business travel resumes, but 30% doesn't. But that still means that the current levels of capacity for airlines, airports, etc., is significantly out of sync. One of the unintended consequences of this is likely to be that, in fact, travel for leisure will become more expensive, because normally business travel, full fare business travel, actually subsidizes the leisure travel. But if there's less business travel, then leisure travel will probably become somewhat more expensive over time. But some industries will not fully recover. The other issue, of course, is that we then enter the economy of the world with virtually all governments having taken on far more debt than they would like in order to give relief during the period of COVID, and also because their tax collections will have been under severe pressure. So essentially, during the period of the COVID thing, government expenses went up, government income went down, and it is devastating to the balance sheets of governments. So that on the one hand. On the other hand, it was also devastating to many business balance sheets and consumer balance sheets. So what we come out with is a situation where the supply side problems caused by COVID will go away roughly by the end of 2021, meaning the fact that your supply chain is not working, that you have workers who break their work because they get COVID, all of those supply problems will go away. So the COVID influence on supply will fade, but the COVID influence on demand will still be around, because it comes from the balance sheets of businesses, governments, and consumers. So what we see is we actually will get a very sharp return to about 98% of the activity we had before COVID. So effectively, 2022 will probably be a year in which global production will end up being about 98% of what it was in 2019. So a fairly fast recovery to close to where we were before. The problem, of course, is that going forward from there, getting back to the levels that you should have been, because remember now, global growth is supposed to be in the order of about 4% per year, if you take it on average. So we should be trying to get back to about 106% of where we were in 2019. So we're about 8% below capacity if we're only back to 98% in 2022. So what that will mean is the economy will still leave a lot to be desired and will still need a lot of stimulus. So the first part of that stimulus will come in terms of very low interest rates. So if we look forward to the full 5 years up to 2025, we'll likely only start to see some increases in interest rates around 2024, 2025. So very low interest rates are likely to be with us for a very long time, and that also goes for South Africa. So in South Africa, we've got interest rates that are lower than they've been for decades, and they're likely to stay low for the foreseeable future, meaning 3 to 5 years of very, very low interest rates. Now, that will, and it already has, started to stimulate very specific sections of the economy. And what you will see is that desirable suburban properties will probably actually increase in value significantly, just because with much lower interest rates, you'll find that affordability of property is much higher, and also people will move from smaller dwellings to larger dwellings in order to be able to work from home. So office workers in South Africa also will often not go back to work, or certainly not go back to work 100% of the time, which will mean that they will need facilities at home, which is comfortable and convenient to work from, and that will probably mean that people will migrate to somewhat larger houses, and those larger houses will be more affordable because of the fact that we have significantly lower interest rates. The other thing that is very likely to happen is that about balance sheets, and therefore what they will do is they will try to stimulate their economies, but they will try to stimulate their economies not through disaster relief the way we saw in 2020, but rather through significant investment programs. And this is likely to happen in virtually every place around the world. Governments will announce large infrastructure programs, and those programs will start to get up to speed from about 2022 onwards, because it takes a while to just get the planning and all the permissions and all of those things in place. So from about 2022, 2023, you're likely to see a significant acceleration in infrastructure build around the world. And a portion of that is likely to be the normal thing, bridges and roads and stuff like that. But it's interesting that there's also very likely to be a significant portion of this that will actually be investment into green power. So a lot of governments, and certainly Joe Biden in the United States, and also to some extent South Africa, this is seen as an opportunity to significantly accelerate the building of green power and investment into green power. So stimulus will run through the green power thing, and that will be for two reasons. The one is in order to really do something about the climate change issues, but the other issue, of course, is that the technology for wind and solar power has become so much cheaper that it actually is overtaking the cost of actually producing power in terms of coal, oil, and gas. So a very significant acceleration in the transition to generating electricity from solar and wind power rather than from the normal old-style coal-fired power stations. So whether that's enough to really turn the whole global warming issue around, not quite clear to me. So I would say we will still in 10 to 15 years sit with the consequences of too much CO2 in the air. But at this point, it looks like there's an acceleration possible, and it comes from a strong desire to stimulate economies through fiscal policy, but that stimulus having to come through investment rather than current expenditure, just because of the fact that you actually have too much debt already on the balance sheets of governments. At the same time, I think that what we will see is we will see all kinds of policy measures that are designed to make it easier for governments to, over time, reduce their debt as percentage of GDP. So the last incident where we saw a massive increase in debt, similar to the increases we saw now, was actually the Second World War. And for roughly 5 years after the Second World War, there was a focus on government and monetary policies that enabled reduction in debt. So part of what that means is interest rates will be kept very low to some extent in order to just stimulate the economy, but also to a very large extent to help governments to not pay too much interest on the debts they owe, which will help them to pay those debts back sooner. The other thing that I would expect, and it certainly will happen in South Africa and in other emerging countries, but it's likely to flow through to developed countries as well, is there will be significant pressure on the pay for public servants. So public servant pay will stay under pressure. So if you're thinking about a career in the public sector, probably not a very comfortable place to be over the next 5 years. So apart from that, given no major other new issues or surprises, which could always happen, what we are likely to see is a gradual return to normal economic activity. And in fact, what you might find is that by the end of the 5 years, we might start to see an acceleration in structural growth in the world economy, just because the amount of investment from governments, because remember now, over the last 20 years, actually slightly more than that, over the last 40 years probably, governments have been under great pressure to reduce their expenses, and the easiest way for governments in the short run to make their balances budget or make their budgets balance is to reduce capital expenditure. So in fact, there's a great need for capital expenditure and infrastructure creation, and if they go about this infrastructure creation correctly, it could well accelerate growth rates from about 2024 onwards, because the new infrastructure will make a lot of things a lot more efficient. For instance, if we could get some more road between Pretoria and Johannesburg, that would also not be a bad plan, or maybe even more rail connections. So it looks like in South Africa, an extension of the Gautrain is part of the infrastructure creation that we can look forward to. So economically, we would expect things to actually gradually improve and to actually be at quite a good space by 2025, meaning quite fast growth without much inflation. So not a terrible outcome, taking a couple of years to get there, but going back to something that is pretty close to normal. Then if we talk about politics in the next 5 years, one of the big things we'll see worldwide is what is the eventual outcome of the two things that we've seen happen at the same time. The one is the massive influence of social media on politics, and the other is the massive rise of populist nationalism worldwide. Now, if I'm talking about populist nationalism, it means that the global approach taken in the 90s and the 2000s by most people in the world, where there was a general acceptance that the best way towards world prosperity is for us to open world markets, to have more trade, more investment across borders, and for us to actually promote a worldwide culture of human rights. This is being undermined in virtually every corner of the world that you turn to. So whether it's Narendra Modi in India, which is really a Hindu nationalist ruler of India, and therefore much more concerned about building the strength of India than to just say we want to promote global prosperity. If you think of Xi in China, also taking a much more Chinese-centric attitude than his predecessors, far less concerned with promoting peace and stability in the rest of the world, much more concerned with promoting Chinese interests, narrower Chinese interests. And of course, Donald Trump was the ultimate manifestation of that. So what we've seen in the last 20 years is the rise of nationalism, and with it leaders who are fairly populist, meaning they don't try to sell the right long-term solutions to their voters. They would rather take a different tack, say what will be popular with my voters, and to use that, and then also to use nationalist slogans to stay in power. Now, of course, we've just seen the defeat of the prime populist in the world, Donald Trump. So we're likely to see a return, at least in the White House, to a much more globalist and less narrowly focused government that's less narrowly focused on the interests of the United States and much more keen to work with their allies, etc. But at the same time, what you have to say is populism is not dead. More than 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, and they hold some fairly narrow populist views. And they've been persuaded of those views through social media. So social media doesn't go away, and also populism doesn't go away. But it's interesting, it will be interesting to see where the balance between populism and national interests and more of a globalist approach will go. Over time, it's clear that for business and for markets and for general prosperity, a globalist approach is clearly much better, but we are clearly seeing that globalist approach being undermined, and it's likely that even moderate governments, so even Joe Biden, will have to do much more to protect specific American workers rather than take the global approach like, let's say, Bill Clinton did 20 years ago. So a very interesting thought is to just think about what's happening to populism versus globalism globally. But the other thing I thought we should just have a quick discussion about is what about the problems of geopolitics. And there, from a kind of Western or American perspective, there are 4 problem countries. So North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China. Now, the major issue with both Iran and with North Korea is the fact that they are trying their best to join the nuclear club, meaning they want nuclear weapons, and they are very unlikely to give up their nuclear weapon programs in full, because actually, interestingly enough, if you think back, the person who actually gave up his nuclear program in order to not be sanctioned was Muammar Gaddafi. And in the end, when there was an uprising against Gaddafi, both the British and the Americans and the French intervened on behalf of the protesters and removed Gaddafi from power, which they would have never been able to do if he had continued with his nuclear program. Now, both North Korea and Iran will certainly have taken that lesson, so they're not about to give up their nuclear programs. The thing to say, though, is that it's not really necessarily a disaster, in the sense that the main reason these countries want nuclear weapons is in order to be able to defend themselves and to defend their regimes, meaning they want to be able to say, don't attack me because I've got nuclear weapons. Iran with Israel, maybe there's a more aggressive intent in terms of their nuclear weapon eventually against Israel, but the main thrust for both of them is really to say, you can't attack me. The other thing is, I think that even the Saudis, even though they were the beneficiary of a lot of Donald Trump's foreign policies, will have come to the conclusion that you can't depend on the Americans to defend you. And it's very likely then that if Iran does get a nuclear weapon, that the Saudis will develop their own. And it will look a little bit like Pakistan and India. It's kind of not a good thing that they've got nuclear weapons necessarily, but at the same time, the world has learned to live with it. So I would say that the most likely outcome of those issues is both of those countries will eventually develop nuclear weapons, and the world will learn to live with it. So actually a significantly more intricate problem is Russia. And the one thing I'll say about Russia is I think that Vladimir Putin has run out of road a little bit, and that both inside Russia and in the near abroad, as they call it, the ex-Soviet countries that they still want to exercise an influence on, Vladimir Putin is becoming quite unpopular, and therefore what we are likely to see is that the Russians will be slightly less focused on being a bad actor across the world and slightly more focused on their own problems. So I don't think Russia is the core problem. The really tough cookie is China. And the problem in China is, first of all, they already have a very significant nuclear arsenal, so it's not something that you can sort out militarily. But then also they have a very significant capacity in conventional arms. So the Chinese have been becoming significantly more aggressive on their borders, meaning they are certainly having some issues with the Indians. So if you have a nationalist government in India and a nationalist government in China, in the 60s there was a short, sharp war between India and China about the border, and we've certainly seen some exchanges, so that becomes a problem. But it becomes a massive problem to say, how do we deal with the Chinese issue? So the original conception in the 1990s was that what you do is you allow China to become an integral part of the capitalist world economy, and that they will become initially capitalist and eventually also gradually democratic. What we've seen is that the Chinese have certainly used the world to become a lot more prosperous. So the miracle of the last 20 years is the reduction in poverty in China, but they've not turned that into significantly more democracy. And also the attitude they're taking towards Taiwan and certainly towards Hong Kong is far less democratic than one would have hoped. So the idea that you can deal with with China by merely integrating them into the rest of the world economy don't really hold water. So I think there's a period, and probably a period of 20 years, of quite sharp exchanges between China and the Western world. But what we do see in the next 5 years is that at least the Western alliance will be much more cohesive in its reaction to China under a Biden administration than it was under a Trump administration. So if you're Donald Trump, you're very aggressive towards the Chinese, but it's actually fairly ineffective because you don't have the Germans and the French with you. If you're Joe Biden, you go talk to the Germans and the French first, and then you go talk to the Chinese with one voice. So I think that will be a lot more effective. But it's a much more long-running problem that is unlikely to blow into anything very serious in the next 5 years. So 5 years from now, we're likely to still see significant trade between China and the rest of the world, although we will see some fairly sharp diplomatic exchanges. So a fairly peaceful, full world returning to a reasonable amount of normality should be a good background for markets. So the interesting thing in markets at this point, if you look at stock markets, what you find is that stock markets on the whole are very high, and also bond markets are very expensive. So basically anything that's listed is quite expensive, and to some extent it's just a consequence of the monetary authorities being extremely aggressive. But within that, you actually see that the non-tech companies are actually still significantly cheaper than they were before the COVID crisis. So there may be pockets of value, and one of the opportunities as we return to normality is to say that those non-tech companies will increase their profitability significantly over the next 5 years, and that is likely to have a positive impact on their share prices. So some opportunities there. The main driver, though, of markets since about the beginning of April has been the actions of the monetary authorities. So I would say that if we look forward to the next 5 years, it's likely that the monetary authorities will stay extremely influential in markets. And the real danger for markets, so in the short run, it's clear that the monetary authorities regard high stock market valuations as a significant part of what they need to do. But what we're likely to see is that as the world economy gets to a point where the economy is self-sustaining and doesn't quite need the same amount of stimulus, we're likely to see at some point that the monetary authorities are happy to accept that share markets should find their own level again. And that's really where the danger comes in. But I would say that for our purposes, what we've got to say is that it's unlikely that the monetary authorities will accept a massive permanent drawdown in stock markets in the next 3 years, and therefore we should actually take a fairly aggressive stance from here on in on share markets, just because there is actually an underwritten put from the monetary authorities. With that, I have to love and leave you. Thank you very much for attending, and we'll see each other in the new year.